Hi guys, this week I had section 1 and I will be going over policy reform for accountability, and our learner objective this week was to be able to describe underlying political issues driving national school reform. So the first big topic we're supposed to discuss is the reforms arising from the civil rights era. And most of the reforms during this time were coming kind of right at the same time of all the civil rights movement. So a lot of the reform during this time was based around ending racial segregation, busing for the purpose of desegregation, and affirmative action and school prayer. So all of these things were kind of put in the light of reform because the whole world was going through the civil rights movement. So this kind of made these areas stand out more than others. The next time frame we're supposed to talk about is the 1980s. And in the 1980s, some of the momentum of educational reform moved from the left, more liberal side to the right, which is the more conservative side. The release of A Nation at Risk, which was Ronald Reagan's effort to reduce or eliminate the U.S. Department of Education. The shift to the right caused many families to seek alternatives, which kind of included charter schools, progressive schools, religious schools, private schools, things of those nature. In the later half of the decade, E.D. Hirsch put forth an influential attack on one or more versions of progressive education, advocating an emphasis on cultural literacy. The facts, phrases, and texts that Hirsch asserted every American had once known, now only some knew. So it was essential for decoding basic texts and maintaining communication. And Hirsch's ideas still remain significant through the 1990s and 21st century and today. They're incorporated into a lot of things that we don't notice, such as classroom practice, textbooks, and curriculum. The 1990s and the 2000s were a really big part of reform, really. Most states and districts in the 1990s adopted OBE, which is outcome-based education, and a state would create a committee to adopt standards and choose quantitative instrument to assess whether the students knew the required content or could perform the required tasks. The standard-based national education goals, which are the Goals 2000, were set by the U.S. Congress in 1990. Most of these goals are based on outcome-based education. Unfortunately, all these goals weren't met by the year 2000, which was kind of the intention, but the standard-based reform movement accumulated into the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, which we still see in 2016 today. OBE reforms usually had other disputed methods, such as constructivist mathematics and whole language. Some proponents advocated replacing the traditional high school diploma with a certificate in initial mastery, and other reform movements were school to work, which would require all students except those in a university track to spend substantial class time on a job site, which honestly is a pretty good idea. Contemporary issues, there is quite a few of them that are kind of hot button topics as of late and throughout the 21st century, really. Some of the things that are and should be being discussed are longer school days or longer school years, after school tutoring, who should fund it, who should it be offered to, charter schools, school choice or school vouchers, smaller class sizes, improved teacher quality, which includes better teacher training, better teacher pay, higher credential standards, and one that I've seen a lot lately is performance bonuses. So pay based off merit. And what this means is some people are arguing that teachers should be paid based off of their standardized scores for their class, which is kind of sketchy if you ask me, but it's a topic that we could see being reformed. Other contemporary issues would be internet and computer access in schools, English only versus bilingual education. So should we only teach our schools in English, or should we be teaching Spanish and French like all the, to specify, it would be teaching like Spanish or French or a second language throughout the whole school. So I don't know if anyone's familiar of the bilingual school in Lexington, but they teach half, I think it's every other day. And one day they teach in English and the next day they teach in Spanish. So it forces the kids, Spanish or not, to learn both languages. Mainstreaming or fully including students with special education needs rather than placing them in special schools. Lately, I feel like inclusion has been really pushed, so I don't know how much of a push there is to segregate disabled students at this point, but it's definitely on the list of contemporary issues. The content of curriculum standards and textbooks. So this kind of goes along with what to teach, who to teach it to, when to teach it. So should kindergartners know how to read, or should algebra be taught to junior students, or should they be taking more of a personal finance class? Student rights is also a huge contemporary issue right now. Another thing we were supposed to discuss is funding levels. So this part kind of confused me, so I'm going to try to dumb it down as much as I can. According to a 2005 report, the United States is tied for first place with Switzerland when it comes to annual spending per student on its public schools. Each of these two countries spend more than 11,000. Oh, sorry guys. Each of these schools spend more than 11,000 per student, and yet America is one of the lowest ranking in actual educational scores or progress scores for the country compared to other rich nations. So despite the high level of funding, U.S. public schools are lagging behind other countries. That kind of goes to show that there's no correlation between per student spending and student performance. The leaders in performance from students would be like Singapore, Finland, and Korea. And oddly enough, all three of these countries have fairly low spending compared to the U.S. per student. This kind of poses a question of, does funding really have to have any direct correlation with performance? It's also been shown that the socioeconomic situation of the student's family has the most influence in determining success. Therefore, if we did pour more money into low poverty schools, would their performance improve enough to be better than those from wealthier districts, if that makes sense? So it's pretty much saying that regardless of how much money you pour into these schools, they may still perform worse than their peers from wealthier districts. In the 1980s, a series of analyses by Eric Henschuk indicated that the amount spent on schools bore little relationship to student learning, but in a different study, they argued that newer schools that have more funding and more technology lead to academic improvements. So like newer buildings, smaller class sizes, which require higher funding, lead to academic improvements. It should also be noted that many of the reform ideas that stray from the traditional format require greater funding. In 1985 in Kansas City, a judge ordered the school district to raise taxes and spend more money on public education. Spending was increased so much that the school district was spending more money per student than any of the other country's other 280 largest school districts. Although this very high level of spending continued for more than a decade, there was no improvement in the school district's academic performance. Another topic we were to discuss is alternatives to public education, which there are quite a few. The United States, you see a lot of private schools or independent schools, and these have been a really popular alternative to public education. But in order to get into a private school, you must pay tuition. A lot of examples of private schools are like religious schools. So I'm from a small community outside of North Platte, and our probably most noted private school would be St. Pat's. which is a Catholic school, a private Catholic school. Another example would be a preparatory or school or a boarding school. And schools based on alternative philosophies such as Montessori education. Over 4 million students, about 1 in 12 children, attend religious schools in the U.S. Most of them are Christian schools. Home education is also blowing up right now. It's favored by a growing number of parents who take direct responsibility for their children's education rather than enrolling them in local public schools, seen as not meeting expectations. So parents are not feeling like the school is doing much for their child, therefore they decide that they can do better and homeschool them. The next topic we were supposed to discuss is school choice. Economics such as Nobel laureate Milton Friedman advocated school choice to promote excellence in education through competition and choice. A competitive market for schools eliminates the need to otherwise attempt a workable method of accountability for results. So in other words, public education vouchers permit guardians to select and pay any school, public or private, with public funds currently allocated to local public schools. By doing this, the theory is that children's guardians will naturally shop for the best schools as much as is already done at a college level. So this would make public schools a market, pretty much. It would be shopping for the best product, and schools would be funded respectively towards what parents think. Though appealing in theory, many reforms based on school choice have led to slight to moderate improvements, which some teachers' union members see as insufficient to offset the decreased teacher pay and job security. Because if this were to happen, as educators, you would see a lot of people losing their jobs, a lot of people losing their pay, because the funding would be cut if their school wasn't receiving those funds. Due to lower income students being required to attend poorer performing inner city schools and not being allowed school choice or better educations that are available to higher income inhabitants of the suburbs, would also be argued why the current school system creates inequality. So in other words, they're saying that because students are kind of forced to go to the school in their district, that they're kind of receiving the short end of the stick, and it's unequal, pretty much. Next topic is is barriers to reform. So, a study by Fordham Institute found that some labor agreements with teachers' unions may restrict the ability of school systems to implement merit pay and other reforms. Contracts were more restrictive in districts with high concentrations of poor and minority students, and the methodology and conclusions of the study have been criticized by teacher unions. Another barrier to reform is assuming that schools are like businesses when in fact they are different. Schools are not like businesses. Legal barriers to reform are low in the U.S. compared to any other countries, which is great. State and local governance of education creates wiggle room for educational innovators, quote, who can change local laws or move somewhere more favorable. Cultural barriers to reform are also relatively low because the question of who should control education is still open. Lastly, we are supposed to discuss digital education, which is obviously a pretty new concept, being how we're kind of this generation is kind of the first one to even have an opportunity at a digital education. So our source tells us that the movement to use computers more in education naturally includes many unrelated ideas, methods, and pedagogies, since there are many uses for digital computers. For example, the fact that computers are naturally good at math leads to the question of the use of calculators in math education. The Internet's communication capabilities make it potentially useful for collaboration and foreign language learning. The computer's ability to simulate physical systems makes it potentially useful in teaching science. More often, however, debate of digital education reform centers around the more general applications of computers to education, such as electronic test-taking and online classes. So, in other words, if you've been in a school in the past 5 years, you're quick to know that everything is becoming digital. Even the classes we take in college as education majors are a lot of the times formed around the ways we can integrate technology into our classrooms. For example, digital literacy. No one was taking that class 20 years ago, but it's actually a key class in learning ways to incorporate technology into your classroom. The idea of creating artificial intelligence led some computer scientists to believe that teachers could be replaced by computers. I highly doubt this happens, but it very well could. The computer is now more understood to be a tool or assistant for the teacher and students, which is exactly what it should be, and personally, I think that it's wonderful. Digitally flipping classrooms, which is a really cool new trend, I think, in digital education. It's gained significant momentum, and the author and visionary for the digital education realm, Will Richardson, points to the not-so-distant future and the seemingly infinite possibilities for digital communication linked to improved education. Education on the whole, as a standalone entity, has been slow to embrace these changes. The use of web tools such as wikis, blogs, social networking sites is tied in increasing overall effectiveness of digital education in the schools. Examples exist of teacher and student success stories where learning has transcended the classroom and has reached far out into society. By using technology, you can link a classroom in small town Nebraska to a classroom in Europe. You can link a classroom in small town Nebraska to a classroom in New York City. They can go on virtual tours. Kids from small town Nebraska can see the Eiffel Tower in a moment of in the time frame of 5 minutes. So it's actually a pretty crazy thing that we're kind of lucky that we get to see the breakthroughs during our time as early educators. And I think that was the last topic. Yes, it was. This is really important for present day education majors and teachers simply because of the fact that the history has taught us a lot. So I think it's important to know about the reforms and the important issues that were stemming clear back in the 1980s in order to effectively teach our own classrooms and learn from the past and learn what's worked and what hasn't, learn what's been issues and what hasn't been issues. I think there's a lot of knowledge to be gained from exploring the history of education because it's something you really don't you don't think about it. It's always been around. It's always, it's something that is so normal and so traditional that we don't really think to look into its history and how things have ended up the way that they are. So I think it's really beneficial as a future educator to know these things and be able to learn from the things that you know from the history. Thanks, guys.